What would you do if strangers in black shirts circled your grandma's wheelchair, swinging a bat and waving forged papers, and the only person standing in their way was a 15-year-old in body armor gripping an AK-47? This wasn't a movie. This was family under attack, and every second pushed closer to betrayal, violence, and truth. Before we begin, like this video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If men in black shirts cornered your grandmother in her wheelchair, bat dragging on the concrete, would you stand frozen or step forward knowing everything could change with one wrong move? That was the moment the street fell silent. When a 15-year-old boy stepped out in body armor, an AK tight in his grip, safety clicked on, eyes burning with a fire no one expected from a kid. The thugs smirked as if they had done this before, as if fear was their only language. But this time they miscalculated. They didn't realize what bloodline they were provoking. Grandma's hands trembled against the armrest, her voice barely a whisper. She spoke of the porch rail her late husband had built the year their son walked out, her eyes wet with memory and grief. The boy's jaw clenched, grip tightening on the rifle, a storm of loyalty rising in his chest. In front of him stood a woman in spotless white clothes, clipboard in one hand, phone in the other, live streaming the scene with a smile sharp enough to cut. She read out loud a supposed 48-hour eviction notice, her words dripping with authority that wasn't real. Every syllable was another blade at his grandmother's dignity. One of the men leaned forward, tapping the bat against the wheelchair's wheel, the hollow clang echoing like a threat. Grandma flinched, her body recoiling as if the sound alone carried pain. The boy's voice broke through, calm but sharp, commanding distance. At the curb, a red pickup idled, its engine humming like a warning. A shadow sat inside, face hidden, watching. The tension pressed down, thick as iron, every second asking the same question. Who was really pulling the strings? Then a voice slid in from the background, deep and measured. "Carry on." The boy froze for half a second, recognizing it. The off-duty deputy who lived down the block, his presence heavy, his tone unreadable. Friend or enemy? The boy couldn't tell. The deputy didn't flash a badge, just let his voice hang, and suddenly the air felt like it could fracture. Karen's smirk widened as she held the phone higher, like she was broadcasting their humiliation to the world. The boy pulled a folded paper from his vest and lifted it high. It wasn't a bluff. It was proof from the state registry showing no HOA was ever filed for their neighborhood. Karen blinked, her hand shifting the clipboard to hide the stamps, but she couldn't mask the tremor in her fingers. One of the thugs lunged for the paper, but the deputy's voice cut through, sharp as steel, warning that one more step would end badly. For the first time, doubt flickered in the thug's eyes. Grandma leaned forward, whispering words meant only for her grandson. "They forged my name." Her face cracked open with despair, the weight of betrayal breaking her voice. His chest tightened. Every betrayal carried a cost, but forging her dignity was the lowest blow of all. Karen's voice sliced through, reading the eviction again as if volume could replace truth. The boy stared into her eyes, refusing to back down. His silence spoke louder than any threat, and for a second, the smirk faltered. Another vehicle slid onto the street, black SUV doors opening, men in matching black shirts stepping out with practiced precision. Karen's tone dropped, a whisper coated in venom. "Move the woman now, before the real cops arrive." Her order was meant to intimidate, but the boy stepped forward, planting himself between his grandmother and the advancing crowd. His young shoulders carried generations of weight, and yet he looked unshakable, as if his body armor was woven from defiance itself. The deputy finally moved into view, hand brushing his jacket, lifting the fabric to reveal a badge clipped to his belt. It wasn't just a neighbor watching anymore. Authority had just entered the field. Karen's phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a single message. "Bulldozer en route." She glanced at it, eyes sparking with cruel satisfaction, while the boy caught the reflection and felt the ground shift beneath him. If a blade was really rolling toward their home, this was more than harassment. This was destruction in motion. Sirens wailed faint in the distance, growing louder, but no one moved. The Batman raised his weapon, swinging in a reckless arc meant to shatter resolve. The boy didn't flinch. His grandmother gripped his arm, whispering his grandfather's name like a shield. The deputy stepped closer, eyes locked on the boy, as if silently passing the torch of responsibility. The street held its breath. The swing hung frozen in the air. The sound of engines roared closer. And then, in one blinding moment, the truth was undeniable. Something massive was on its way, and none of them knew if it would stop. The squad car finally rolled down the street, red and blue faint against the tension, but it didn't stop. The officer inside slowed, met eyes with the woman in white, and nodded like they'd done this before. The boy's chest tightened, his grandmother's hand clamped down on his wrist, and the bat clattered against the driveway, as if even the thug knew the signal meant something deeper. Why would law side with fraud? Why would a uniform feel like another weapon? The boy moved fast, ripping open a folder and throwing pages across the hood of the nearest car. Maps, registry printouts, and emails fluttered, ink screaming the truth that no HOA had ever been filed. One page bore a notary stamp from a bank 2 towns away, dated on the very day his grandmother was being wheeled through a clinic. Someone had stolen her absence and turned it into a weapon. The proof sliced through the air like fire, and the woman in white tilted her head, hiding her smirk behind the clipboard, but her eyes betrayed her fear. She knew this wasn't bluff. This was blood truth. Then the boy froze. His uncle's name gleamed on the page as a witness to the forged signature. Grandma's lips parted, her face draining color as if her own blood had betrayed her. The boy's breathing sharpened, rage and heartbreak battling for space in his chest. Karen tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a tiny smile curling, counting her victory like coins already pocketed. Family had become the traitor, and that cut deeper than any bat or bulldozer ever could. The deputy pulled his phone, voice loud and clear on speaker. He demanded dispatch confirm a code officer on site. The reply came back fast and cold. The HOA removal had already been cleared. The deputy's brow folded, his voice cracking like thunder. There is no code officer assigned today. The lie was exposed, yet Karen calmly lifted a folder stamped with condemnation, embossed with a seal that shimmered with false authority. Who minted that power when every office was closed? Who handed her this weapon? Tension snapped as another man in black stepped from the garage, toolbox in hand, bolt cutter gleaming. He strode directly toward the wheelchair, jaws clenched, eyes hollow. The boy's voice cut through, sharp and unwavering, warning once. The man didn't stop. Metal teeth gnashed closer to the footrests until the deputy's hand shot forward, knocking it aside, steel clanging against pavement. Sparks of defiance lit the moment, and across the street, a camera lens blinked red. Every breath, every betrayal, was now immortalized. But who would control that footage? The truth tellers or the liars? Grandma's voice cracked, spilling secrets she had buried. She had mortgaged the house once to protect the very man who betrayed them, her son, the uncle whose name inked the page. She had sold heirlooms to keep him free, had lived in silence so the family name didn't burn in shame. Tears cut across her cheeks as she admitted it, and the boy's hand steadied her chin. Not today. His eyes glowed with defiance. Not anymore. Karen hissed to her crew, roll the truck in 5, her tone dripping with confidence as if the fight was already won. What debt was so large it justified destroying blood? The boy raised his voice for everyone to hear. He promised the truth wasn't in those papers, but in the drive he carried against his chest, a flash drive stamped with a school logo, his own secret weapon. He vowed to reveal it before this story even reached its next breath. Karen's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening. How did a teenager breach her fortress? What secrets lived in that tiny device that could topple her empire? If you've ever seen paperwork used as a weapon, you know how it feels like chains. Tell your story in the comments, because silence lets them win. And if you want this grandmother to keep her home, smash like so this fight spreads beyond this street. What proof would you show if your entire bloodline was under attack? The cruiser that had passed returned, tires grinding, door opening. A new officer stepped out, slow, calculated, removing sunglasses with a flick. His words froze the street. There is no HOA here, and these men are already on a watch list. Karen's smile cracked for the first time, her face draining, but then she lifted a fresh weapon. A temporary court order, signed this morning, seal gleaming. A paper sword sharper than any blade, but whose hand had signed the name before dawn. The deputy's eyes widened. The signature belonged to a retired judge who had moved out of state last year. He snapped into his radio, demanding internal affairs on the line. The boy tore the flash drive from his vest and held it high, plugging it into the deputy's own phone. Payment logs glowed on the screen, transfers pumping into shell companies with Karen's middle initial burned into them. For the first time, her hand trembled. The empire she built was cracking in the palm of a teenager. Then the rumble came. Heavy, earth-shaking, impossible to ignore. The ground itself vibrated as a yellow bulldozer turned onto the street, hazard lights blinking like the countdown of a bomb. Karen raised her folder like a flag of power, her smirk returning as if the machine itself was her army. The Batman grinned wide, his teeth glinting in the streetlight. The officer's hand slid to his holster, waiting for a move. The boy stepped forward again, planting himself between the blade and his grandmother's fragile frame. The bulldozer did not slow. The roar grew louder. Sparks of fear lit every face on the street. The question cut like steel through the night. Would the blade stop, or would someone have to stop it? The blade kept coming like a dare. The boy shifted his feet, squared his shoulders, and leveled the muzzle at the bulldozer's hydraulic line, calm as a surgeon and twice as certain. Karen in white lifted her folder higher, voice steady as if paper could command steel. The deputy called for backup again and got static, a flat wall of silence that felt intentional. Someone had pinched the line between help and harm, and they were smiling about it. A neighbor rushed out clutching a tablet, breathless, shouting that the whole street was watching live. Comments scrolled faster than a heartbeat, half begging the boy to hold the line, half taunting grandma with phrases that burned. Another neighbor, the friendly wave and weekend hello kind, hung back near his mailbox, hand in his pocket where a set of HOA ID tags flashed like a secret handshake. The boy saw it, locked eyes, and in that tiny moment the mask slipped. Not a neighbor. A plant, placed like a pawn. Grandma's voice reached up through the clatter, small and steady, speaking to a picture she kept tucked in her lap of the man who built the rail and promised she would never be moved by force. Her fingers traced his name like a prayer. The boy heard it, and something old and immovable clicked into place. He told the driver to stop. No tremor, no stutter, a command that sounded older than he was. The dozer rolled forward anyway, blade lowering until metal kissed the edge of the driveway. Sparks danced. The Batman laughed under his breath and tapped the bat twice, like a ref calling a foul. The undercover officer's eyes, still unknown to nearly everyone, studied the driver with a look that promised receipts. The deputy snapped, "Stand down," but the machine groaned against the order like it didn't speak that language. A shotgun racked somewhere behind them, the hard scrape of intent, and every head turned like a compass needle. New player on the board. New risk. New consequence. The neighbor with the tablet swung his camera toward the sound, hungry for views. The chat exploded with demands, theories, insults, prayers. The woman in white started narrating to her stream, pretending to be the victim of a dangerous family, painting grandma as a stubborn rule breaker and the boy as a reckless menace. The algorithm was her courtroom, and she was confident the verdict would lean her way. The boy answered by switching the safety off and aiming at the line that would freeze that blade in a single breath. He didn't yell threats. He didn't posture. He simply drew a boundary that felt like law. The deputy took a half step closer, voice low and steady, telling the driver there would be criminal charges for every inch forward. No answer came from the cab, just the grind of power and the unmoving face behind a dark visor. The undercover officer shifted his weight, fingers resting near his badge under the work coat, eyes always calculating routes that kept grandma safe and evidence solid. He was counting variables, tracing lines of blame, and waiting for the moment that would turn this chaos into a record that stuck. The friendly neighbor finally pulled the ID tags fully into view, pinched between his fingers like a truth he couldn't hide anymore. He said he was only verifying compliance, only serving the community, only here because someone had to keep standards. The boy asked him who signed his paycheck. The answer stumbled. The woman in white jumped in, claiming oversight from a regional board that didn't exist, layering fiction on fiction with the speed of a practiced liar. The deputy asked for a registration number. She quoted a code that belonged to a different county. It landed like a confession. Grandma lifted her chin and called out that the porch rail had held 3 generations' worth of grief and birthdays and promises, and no board that never filed anything would rip that memory from her bones. The Batman flinched at the strength in her voice and made the smallest retreat, a step so minor most missed it. The boy saw everything. He saw the doubt forming, and he pressed it, telling them there was one last chance to walk away with dignity before the blade met the ground, and the world saw whose hands were on the controls. If you would stand where he stood, if you would hold a line for someone who once held you up, tap like now and tell where you're watching from. Because this is how fraud survives. It counts on silence more than fear, and it folds fast when everyone sees it at once. The neighbor with the ID tags muttered into his phone, quiet and urgent, and the red pickup at the curb revved like a signal. The dozer finally paused, as if considering. Karen called to her crew to move the woman anyway, trying to turn bodies into leverage. The undercover officer shifted into their path with a single step that said not today. The deputy pointed at the driver's visor and ordered it up. No reaction. The boy took one more stride forward and set his finger into a truth that would stop the machine without taking a life. The chat begged him to hold and begged him to fire, a chorus of strangers writing two possible futures. The driver made a decision. The blade dipped one more inch, metal singing. The boy's muzzle tracked the hydraulic line and settled like a gavel. Karen threatened lawsuits and jail and community service for defiance, then hesitated when she realized the camera angles had multiplied. Every porch, every phone, every lens was pointed at her white blazer and her forged authority. The power she wielded depended on darkness. Daylight had turned her crown to paper. The deputy counted down to a citation for reckless endangerment. 3, 2. The driver finally snapped his visor up with a jerk, and the street sucked in a breath. The face behind the glass wore the same black HOA shirt as the thugs on the driveway, the same logo that didn't exist in any registry, the same emblem stamped on fake fines. Not a neutral operator, not a city contractor, just another piece of a scheme built on fear and signatures that never belonged to the people they claimed to protect. The boy didn't lower the rifle. The deputy didn't lower his hand. The undercover officer didn't blink. The neighbor with the tablet whispered that the stream just crossed 100,000 viewers and kept climbing. The friendly neighbor with the tags tried to slide them back into his pocket. Too late. The dozer idled with a growl like a cornered thing. Karen's smile trembled along its edges. And then a new voice cut through from the side yard, tired and furious and known to every heart on that driveway. Put the gun down, kid. This is family business. The shotgun slid into view, and the man holding it wore a face that matched the name on the forged page. Grandma's son, the boy's uncle. Betrayal stood in the open, armed and unashamed, and the street felt that old promise. The one that says blood will protect blood, snapped like a dry twig under a boot. The shotgun leveled at the boy's chest like the end of trust itself. The man holding it, his own uncle, let the word family drip with venom as he barked that the papers were real because he signed them. Grandma's cry cracked across the driveway, a sound that carried both disbelief and recognition. She shouted his name like a plea, reminding him of the years she pawned her jewelry to bail him out, the nights she sat awake wondering if he'd live through his own mistakes. He didn't even flinch. He sneered that loyalty had never paid his debts. Karen's smirk widened, her voice slicing through the moment as she thanked him for his cooperation. He snarled back for her to shut her mouth, the barrel swinging her way for half a second. The deputy kept his weapon low but steady, his tone iron. He asked the uncle where he truly stood, because tonight would decide forever. The boy didn't blink. He raised his own weapon, a heartbeat away from an explosion that would tear their family apart in front of everyone watching. Grandma's sobs bled into rage. She told her son he was tearing the last piece of his father's legacy, that the rail they wanted gone was built with his own hands after war, meant to hold them together when life tried to split them apart. Her voice cracked with memories of birthdays on that porch. The night storms raged while they sang inside. The day his father died, and the rail was the only thing she held on to. The uncle's face twisted, eyes flickering with something buried, but his grip on the shotgun only tightened. The boy's jaw locked. He told his uncle that if he took one more step, the barrel would answer for him. The uncle laughed, bitter and sharp, declaring that fear never kept him in line, not even when the courts tried. The words landed heavy, almost daring the boy to prove what blood loyalty was worth. Every second stretched like a rope pulled tight, ready to snap. Then the new officer who had arrived earlier stepped closer, calm but cutting. He said the uncle wasn't just greedy, he was already on their radar, investigated for funneling money through fake HOAs across multiple counties. The words froze everyone. Karen's face drained color. The uncle's eyes went wide, rage boiling into disbelief. He barked back that it was lies, that she was the one stealing his cut. His voice trembled, not with fear, but with wounded pride. Betrayal wasn't theory anymore. It was now a full collapse in their ranks. The boy didn't move. He kept the muzzle steady, watching his uncle unravel. Grandma whispered again, her voice like broken glass, telling her son that she had loved him when no one else would, that she had chosen him over her own peace, and this was how he returned it. Her heartbreak landed heavier than any bullet could. For the first time, his uncle blinked too long, like guilt had slipped under his skin. Then everything flipped in one breath. The uncle swung the shotgun, but not toward the boy. He turned it on Karen, accusing her of stealing his cut, of forging more than just papers. Karen's smirk shattered, her eyes flashing fear for the first time as she demanded he lower it. The black shirts froze, unsure where to point their loyalty. The deputy inched closer, weapon angled, voice sharp enough to cut the silence. He demanded the uncle make a choice right there in front of everyone. The boy stood still, his breath measured, his eyes flicking between a woman with forged power and an uncle with poisoned blood. Betrayal and humiliation wrapped tight around the driveway, every second daring someone to break first. The crowd of neighbors whispered, their streams buzzing with the question none of them dared to answer out loud. Who would fire first? The traitor who carried the family name, or the woman who had built her empire on lies? The uncle's finger tightened on the trigger, jaw clenched, eyes wild. Karen raised the folder like a shield, voice cracking as she promised money was still coming. The boy stepped forward half an inch, enough to make them both twitch, enough to remind them that even in their war of greed, a teenager stood between them and the woman they had tried to break. And then the sound came, sharp and unforgiving, steel clicking into place as if the world itself was ready for someone to bleed. The uncle's laugh cut short, his eyes narrowing into something dangerous. The boy didn't blink. The deputy didn't waver. Grandma didn't breathe. The next heartbeat would decide whether betrayal ended in blood or whether justice finally stepped out of the shadows. The shotgun thundered first, shredding the white folder in Karen's hands and flinging counterfeit pages into the air like a blizzard of lies. Paper slashed across faces, stuck to windshields, skittered under boots. The bulldozer jolted to a halt and the driver jerked his head, stunned that the script didn't match the plan. Karen barked that it was forgery. The uncle snarled that she cheated him, and the boy stepped up, body between chaos and the woman who had raised his father and then raised him. One page didn't fly. It trembled in Grandma's lap, edges worn from decades of being folded and unfolded, a soft rectangle of history that carried ink no forger could mimic. She lifted it with both hands, voice trembling but clear. This was the title, The First and Last Truth, signed by the man who built the rail when war took most of his words, but not his promise. The crowd hushed for half a heartbeat, the kind of silence that only shows up when memory outranks money. The deputy snatched a loose sheet from the air and scanned it fast, then read out the line that made the driveway gasp. Transfers to an offshore account. Dates matched the bullying visits, amounts too big to hide, initials that matched the woman in white. The neighbors shifted, streams pinged, comments exploded. 1,000 strangers saw numbers that spoke louder than speeches. Karen lunged for the paper like a drowning swimmer for a rope, but the boy blocked her with a forearm and a warning that needed no extra words. The uncle edged forward, shotgun lowered now, eyes locked on the title like a starving man staring at a meal he didn't earn. He said it belonged to the family, meaning himself, meaning anything he could cash. Grandma pressed the parchment to her chest, a quiet shake of the head that cut deeper than a shouted no. Her son flinched at that tiny motion, the way a boy flinches when caught stealing from his mother's purse, then masked it with anger and demanded she hand it over for safekeeping. The boy answered that safety had never lived in those hands. A new voice ripped the tension sideways. The bulldozer driver tore off his helmet and yanked open his jacket, revealing a wire taped across his chest and a badge clipped low. Undercover, fully recorded, every order and insult archived. This wasn't just a neighborhood fight anymore. It was a case with teeth. Karen staggered back a step, eyes scattering across faces for any ally still willing to be seen. The Batman stared at his shoes. The friendly neighbor shoved his ID tags deep into his pocket and tried to meld into a fence he didn't deserve to lean on. The undercover officer said the quiet part out loud. The fake HOA was a shell, the shell was a wash, and the wash ran through people who wore tidy blazers and called harassment compliance. He nodded toward the title in Grandma's hands and said that paper had more authority than any stamp on Karen's clipboard. The boy watched her carefully in that moment, because people who build empires on bluff don't fold. They flee or they bite. She fled. A sudden spin, a sprint to the street, heels slapping time against asphalt. The uncle pivoted to track her, shotgun lifting. His finger hovered on the curve where worst decisions are born. The deputy swore under his breath and moved to block the shot, not because she deserved safety, but because justice needed her breathing and talking on record. The undercover officer flashed his badge high, voice flat with command, but the uncle's face had already slid into that place where consequences can't reach. Grandma broke the spell with a sentence that felt like a lifetime squeezed into one breath. She told her son he was standing on his father's promise with a gun pointed at the future. He paused just long enough for shame to try climbing the wall he had built inside. The boy saw that hesitation and stepped in, voice steadier than a teenager's has any right to be, telling the uncle to put the shotgun down and walk back to the living. The man's lips twitched like a smile, but it was only pride trying to breathe. Across the street, a neighbor yelled that the stream had crossed 250,000 viewers. Another shouted that the bank transfers were being mirrored on community pages. Light had finally outrun the lies. Even so, lies don't surrender politely. Karen dove into the open door of a sedan, yelling at someone to go, go, go. The undercover officer planted himself in the lane, hand out, badge visible, knees bent for impact. The sedan braked hard, tires screaming, driver's hands raised in surrender. Not everyone in that circle wanted to end their life in headlines. The deputy swept another paper from the ground and read the name of a retired judge used to stamp mourning orders from a state the judge no longer lived in. The new officer, the one who had returned after the suspicious cruiser, radioed internal affairs with a voice that promised careers were about to end. The boy kept scanning faces, measuring where risk sat now that panic had broken formation. Every time his eyes found Grandma, his shoulders squared a little more. Her title didn't shake in those hands. That steadiness guided him. He turned back to the uncle and laid out the simplest truth. If the shotgun went down, if the title stayed with the woman who kept birthdays and funerals under the same roof, the rest could still be fixed with cuffs and signatures. If not, everything shattered forever. The uncle swallowed, jaw-jumping. He muttered about debt collectors who never stop, about phone calls that steal sleep, about a lifetime of feeling smaller than men with polished shoes and easy smiles. His voice thinned and turned raw. For a second, he looked young. For a second, he looked reachable. Karen ruined it. From the car, she shouted that his cut was waiting if he cleared the driveway, that men who hesitate lose everything. The old hunger flared. The shotgun rose again. The undercover officer shifted to protect the sedan's driver. The deputy lifted his weapon just high enough to matter. The boy locked on, not at his uncle's chest, but at the lever that would drop the shotgun harmless if a miracle happened. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He gave the moment one last chance to choose dignity. If your heart is with this grandmother, show it right now. Drop a heart in the comments and tell where you're watching from. Because this fight is bigger than one porch. It's every family that ever held a home together when paperwork tried to break it. The uncle gritted his teeth and lunged for the title, shotgun angling to clear a path. The boy moved, forearm blocking, muzzle steady, breath measured. Karen shoved the sedan door wider like an exit wound. The undercover officer shouted freeze. The deputy yelled drop it. The neighbors leaned forward as one. The world narrowed to fingertips on triggers and the old paper in a grandmother's hands. Steel and will collided in a single heartbeat, and three weapons aligned on the same thin line of decision. The boy's finger tightened, the deputy's stance locked, the uncle's jaw set. Somewhere a phone fell, somewhere a child cried, somewhere a prayer slipped between teeth. The air itself felt like a wire pulled to breaking. And then the world chose. A flash, a crack, a shock that slammed through ribs and rang inside skulls. Someone fired, and for a long, echoing second, no one knew who. The gunshot cracked the night in half. For a frozen moment, nobody knew where it came from or who had fallen. Then the uncle staggered, leg buckling, shotgun clattering across the hood of the truck as blood spread down his jeans. He screamed in fury, not pain, pointing a shaking finger at the boy as if the teenager had fired. But the deputy stepped forward, weapon still smoking, voice cutting sharp. He had pulled the trigger, and he had aimed to disable, not kill. The air trembled with relief and terror at once. Grandma's hands clutched the title tighter, her knuckles white. She begged her grandson not to fire, not to become what betrayal wanted him to be. Her words, raw and desperate, sliced straight through the chaos. The boy's eyes burned with a storm of loyalty and rage, but his finger eased back from the trigger, his chest rising and falling like a furnace. He turned the AK just enough to show he wasn't going to let the family name force him into spilling family blood. The choice carried weight heavier than the weapon itself. The undercover officer tore open his vest to show the impact marks from earlier blasts, reminding everyone he had already taken a bullet so truth could live. He yelled that the feds were already on their way, that this was no longer a neighborhood fight, but a federal sting that stretched far wider. Karen screamed over him, claiming she had judges in her pocket, claiming signatures higher than the law itself. Her bravado cracked, but she clung to it, desperate to convince someone that her empire still mattered. The crowd whispered, restless, their doubt painting her weaker than any bullet could. The uncle, bleeding but alive, stumbled toward the bulldozer with wild eyes. He shouted that he would finish this himself, that he would bury the porch rail and every memory tied to it. He limped across the gravel, dragging himself into the cab like a man possessed. The boy sprinted forward, body a blur, AK barrel slamming against the metal frame as he blocked his uncle's climb. He pressed the muzzle to the lever, warning that one more move would end not just the machine, but him. The uncle froze, hatred and shame fighting in his face, then shoved back hard, spitting that blood meant nothing anymore. Grandma's voice rose, breaking with grief as she screamed her son's full name. The sound struck him harder than any bullet. He froze mid-motion, his chest heaving, his jaw trembling like a boy caught stealing again. For a second his eyes softened, guilt flickering like a candle in the wind. But it was brief. He grabbed for the barrel, trying to wrench it free, both of them struggling, each heartbeat pulling the trigger closer to deciding fate. The deputy lunged forward, shouting for them to stop, shouting that this wasn't the way. The sound of sirens drew closer, louder, a storm descending. Red and blue flickered against the walls as federal SUVs swung into the street. Agents poured out, weapons raised, voices booming. Karen tried to run, heels snapping against the asphalt, but the undercover officer slammed her path shut, badge high, voice unshakable. She spun, desperation naked now, and shrieked that she had power beyond them, that none of this would stick. The crowd laughed bitterly, neighbors spitting words that cut more than handcuffs ever could. The uncle still gripped the boy's weapon, his face twisted, sweat and blood mixing as his body sagged. Grandma cried louder, demanding he stop before he ripped the last piece of himself away. For half a second, it looked like he might let go. Then another hand joined the fight, the deputies pushing the barrel down, forcing distance, forcing survival. A shot went off, shattering pavement, but no one fell. The uncle collapsed against the truck, sobbing curses, pinned between betrayal and justice. Karen kept screaming as agents cuffed her, calling everyone traitors, her voice breaking when one officer read her rights into the stream that still hadn't stopped. Her white blazer smeared with dirt, her clipboard shattered. She looked less like authority and more like the fraud she was. The crowd roared with vindication, comments exploding with hearts, fire emojis, words of solidarity. The lie had been lit up for everyone to see. Grandma's hand shook as she reached for her grandson. Her voice cracked, pleading with him not to carry this weight on his shoulders forever. She told him that his grandfather's courage lived in him, but so did his compassion, and compassion was the legacy she prayed he would choose. The boy's eyes glistened, tears mixing with sweat as he let the AK dip, finally lowering it, showing that he wasn't going to let rage define him. For the first time all night, his face looked 15 again. And just when the street felt like it had finally taken a breath, a flash of movement jolted everyone back. The uncle, eyes red with fury, hands slipping to his boot, dragged out a hidden pistol. He raised it with a scream that tore the night apart, aiming straight at the boy. Gasps ripped through the crowd. Neighbors froze. The deputy spun. Agents shouted warnings. Grandma screamed louder than sirens. The trigger began to pull, slow but certain. The boy stared at the man who shared his blood, who carried his father's name, who had traded loyalty for greed. He didn't blink. He didn't move. His finger brushed the trigger of the rifle again, every second daring fate to decide who would live and who would fall. The whole world hung in that impossible pause, and the next sound would carve history into stone. The pistol rose, the uncle's eyes wild, his finger curling back slow as if time itself wanted to watch the betrayal unfold. Grandma screamed her son's name, voice cracking with decades of broken prayers. The boy didn't flinch. He stared into the face that carried his bloodline and refused to move. In that razor-thin second, the deputy's shot cracked through the air, striking the uncle in the leg. The pistol fired wild into the pavement, sparks spitting where the bullet landed, harmless but loud enough to echo down every hallway of memory. The uncle collapsed, groaning, clutching his wound as the weapon skidded across the driveway. Agents swarmed, tackling him down, snapping cuffs around wrists that had carried nothing but excuses for years. Karen shrieked that it wasn't over, her white clothes stained, her face twisted in rage as agents pinned her to the ground. Neighbors erupted, some cheering, some weeping, every camera still streaming as if the entire world had been watching the downfall of fraud in real time. Her empire of threats and paper crumbled under the weight of truth, and her scream was the sound of a crown turned to ash. Grandma lifted the title high, her voice breaking as she declared this house was theirs, that her husband's promise lived here still. The crowd erupted in applause, comments flooding streams with hearts, prayers, and rage turned into solidarity. She looked down at her grandson, her lips trembling as she told him she saw his grandfather's courage in his eyes, and for the first time in years, hope softened the cracks in her face. The boy dropped the rifle to his side, tears streaking through the grit, his chest shaking with everything he had carried. For a moment he looked like a child again, but one who had been forced to grow too fast. The deputy steadied the scene, but his voice softened when he looked at the boy. He said not many grown men could hold a line like that, and fewer still with the weight of family aimed against them. The undercover officer nodded, adding that without the boy's evidence, the sting would have crumbled. The kid who was supposed to be just a teenager had forced truth into daylight, and everyone knew it. The crowd shouted his name, phones buzzing with support, strangers already calling him a hero and comments flying faster than anyone could read. Grandma's frail hand touched his cheek, her voice cracking as she said today his grandfather would be proud. The boy broke then, not in weakness but in release, sobbing into the shoulder of the woman who had been at the center of it all. He whispered he had only done what he had to do, but she answered softly that he had done more. He had restored their name when others tried to bury it. The moment burned into everyone's memory, an image too raw to ever fade. If you felt that in your chest, hit like right now and drop a heart in the comments for Grandma, because the more people see this, the fewer families will ever fall for a scam dressed as authority. And tell us where you're watching from, because every place has someone who needs this story. Federal agents announced charges live, their voices cutting through the noise. The fake HOA was a shell that laundered millions, tied to corrupt judges, bankers, and contractors. Every name on the roster was being read into custody, every page of lies turned into evidence. Karen spat that she would be back, that money never stays gone, but her words were drowned out by the roar of neighbors who had tasted victory. For the first time in years, their fear was gone, replaced by a power that didn't need uniforms to breathe. The uncle was hauled into a cruiser, his face pale, his eyes hollow, muttering that debts had dragged him into the mud. His son stared back at him once, not with anger, but with the heavy truth that sometimes bloodlines cut their own ties. Karen was shoved into a separate car, her screams muffled, her head lowered not by choice but by the weight of handcuffs. The driveway that had been marked for demolition was now marked by justice. Grandma wheeled forward, the title still clutched in her lap, neighbors gathering around in silence that spoke louder than cheers. They bowed their heads, some touched her hand, some patted the boy's shoulder, all acknowledging that this family had carried their fight for everyone. The boy nodded, swallowing hard, his tears drying into resolve. He wasn't just 15 anymore. He was the reason truth had survived tonight. As tow trucks hooked the bulldozer, dragging the machine away like a beast finally chained, the deputy leaned close to the boy and whispered that another neighborhood was under attack, that the same network had sent thugs across town. His words carried a warning and an invitation. Would he stand again? The boy's jaw tightened, his eyes lifting to the horizon. He didn't answer, but the fire in his stare said everything. And that is where the story leaves us. A grandmother who refused to bow, a boy who chose courage over fear, a family fractured by betrayal but rebuilt by truth, and a fraud empire crushed under the weight of justice. This wasn't just a fight for one porch rail. It was proof that paper bullies break when people stand together. Before you go, if you believe in protecting families like this video now, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And drop a heart in the comments for the boy who stood armed not with rage, but with resolve. Because tonight wasn't just survival. It was karma written in blood, ink, and courage. And the fight isn't over. It never is.